What if the person standing up for justice wasn't a seasoned lawyer, but a 15-year-old girl armed with nothing but courage, determination, and a deep belief in what's right? What if one teenager's voice could challenge an entire system built to silence the vulnerable? Would you have the strength to speak out when powerful people try to shut you down? Emily Taylor didn't plan on becoming a symbol of change. She just wanted to make sure one child wasn't denied an education. But as she steps into a courtroom filled with skeptics and cameras, Emily discovers this fight is bigger than one case. How far would you go to defend what's right when no one expects you to win? Join us in reflecting on this true story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification for more daily stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you are watching. For we would love to hear from you. Emily Taylor stood at the center of the crowded courtroom, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the murmurs rippling across the audience. Judge Harold Carver sat perched above, his gaze piercing as he studied this teenage girl who dared to argue constitutional law in his presence. He peered over his glasses and said, in a tone oozing with skepticism, "So, Miss Taylor, I believe a high school sophomore is prepared to lecture me on constitutional rights." Laughter fluttered among the onlookers, but Emily refused to back down. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the podium, swallowing her nerves before speaking. "Yes, Your Honor. This is bigger than just one student. This is about the rights of millions." Her unwavering conviction briefly silenced the scoffing crowd. Only 6 months ago, Emily's life in Willow Creek, California, was far simpler. She was used to morning classes and evenings spent poring over homework or practicing basketball. At 15, she excelled academically but remained shy, often overshadowed by louder classmates or star athletes. Her father, a passionate civil rights lawyer named James Taylor, was her hero. He'd return home with stories of landmark cases that shifted public policies, and Emily soaked them up, though she never imagined she would soon stand in a courtroom herself. Late one night, Emily noticed her father's uncharacteristic exhaustion. He sat at the dining table, burying his face in his hands. When she offered him a plate of leftovers, he managed a tired smile, but said little. Finally, he confessed he was representing a young girl, someone who had been denied entry into a local public school for dubious reasons. This case, he insisted, could set a critical precedent for equal education. Emily's father was the type of lawyer who believed that justice, though often elusive, could be claimed through tenacity and truth. But the opposing side, backed by powerful officials, was determined to see the lawsuit tossed out before it even reached a judge's bench. Emily's father admitted resources were tight and time was running thin. Emily felt a spark of frustration ignite within her. She couldn't stand by while a child was barred from school simply because of a bureaucratic policy. Then fate intervened. While rummaging through her father's law books in a quiet corner of his study, Emily stumbled on an old Supreme Court ruling tied to educational rights. Its language was clear, echoing the same principles her father had fought for his entire career. Inspired, she confronted him with a bold proposal. "Let me argue this case. I know I'm just 15, but you always taught me that if something is unfair, we have a duty to speak up." He stared at her in stunned silence. "Emily, real courtrooms aren't like debate club. Judges and opposing attorneys will cut you down the moment you slip up." But she was steadfast. She insisted that if equal access to education was truly a right, then the law belonged to everyone willing to defend it, including a teen who believed in standing up for someone cast aside. Reluctantly, her father agreed to guide her as she pored over statutes, constitutional amendments, and case law from every angle. Night after night, they rehearsed arguments at the kitchen table. Emily recited legal precedents as though they were lines in a play, determined to understand every nuance. Whenever she faltered, she picked herself up and tried again, fueled by a sense of moral clarity that, though untested, burned brightly. Finally, the day arrived. Emily's father filed a motion requesting that she be allowed to represent the plaintiff's argument. Word spread quickly. The idea of a teenage girl stepping into a courtroom to debate matters of law outraged some and intrigued others. Spectators filled the benches, camera crews hovered around the building, and suddenly the pressure felt far greater than a school debate. Yet, her father's quiet confidence and her own sense of righteous purpose kept her grounded. Standing at that podium, hearing the clatter of whispered judgments, Emily braced herself. She saw the trace of a smirk on Judge Carver's lips and the condescending glances from the opposing counsel. But she thought of that girl, someone she had never met, who just wanted to walk through the front doors of a classroom. That thought alone gave her the strength to face whatever came next. Days before her dramatic debut in court, Emily had combed through law books piled on the kitchen counter, her study sessions stretching late into the night. She flipped pages with an eagerness bordering on desperation. She had discovered cases where students successfully fought for fair treatment. But she also read about devastating losses when power and money overshadowed the quest for justice. The more she read, the more she recognized the enormity of what she was undertaking. Between preparing her speech and analyzing statutes, Emily confronted waves of doubt. As she practiced her arguments, she wondered if people would laugh at her for having the audacity to stand before a seasoned judge. She was so young. Did that disqualify her from seeking justice? Her father, noticing her apprehension, would repeat the same refrain. Remember why you're doing this. The law should serve everyone, especially those who can't fight for themselves. That conviction carried her through the courthouse doors. On the day of her first appearance, Judge Carver made it quite clear he regarded her as more of a curiosity than a legitimate legal voice. Yet Emily refused to be rattled. As she laid out her preliminary remarks, she saw the judge's grin waver just a fraction when she cited a key Supreme Court case to anchor her argument. The spectators leaned in, sensing the tension. "Your Honor," she said firmly, scanning the courtroom, "my argument is not about a minor technicality. It's about whether a public school can deny a child access to an education based on arbitrary regulations. If we fail to question that, then we fail every child who stands on the same precipice." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Emily caught glimpses of reporters scribbling notes. Meanwhile, Nancy Whitaker, an attorney representing the school board, eyed Emily with open disdain. After Emily's remarks, Whitaker rose and demanded the court dismiss the case outright. "This is a charade," she insisted, her voice dripping with condescension. "We cannot allow an unlicensed teen to stand here and deliver legal arguments as though she's qualified counsel." Before Judge Carver could speak, Stephanie Grant, the Department of Justice lawyer who had been monitoring these education disputes, entered the conversation. In a calm yet authoritative tone, she explained, "Your Honor, there's legal precedent for allowing a party with a vested interest to present an argument, especially if they've done their due diligence. Ms. Taylor represents a student's perspective, someone directly impacted by the policies at issue." The crowd buzzed with curiosity. Why had the DOJ taken an interest? Emily, too, was taken aback. She had not anticipated such high-level engagement, but she certainly wasn't complaining. The judge, for his part, allowed the case to proceed for the moment, declaring he would reserve judgment on Whitaker's motion until he saw more evidence. Outside the courtroom, Emily nearly collapsed with relief. Her father pulled her aside, his brow knit with worry. "Emily," he said quietly, "this is bigger than you realize. If the DOJ is stepping in, there's a chance your argument could shape state or even federal education policy. Are you ready for that weight?" Emily inhaled slowly. "I don't know if anyone's ever fully ready," she admitted, "but we can't turn back." In her mind's eye, she pictured that denied student, just a kid who'd been blocked from school doors. The fear that burned in her own chest felt small compared to the injustice inflicted upon children who were systematically turned away. Later that evening, Emily returned home to find a message waiting in the mailbox. It was a letter with no return address. "Back off while you can. Kids should stick to playing games, not messing with politics." A cold dread spread through her. Threats? Over a lawsuit for educational access? She had expected legal pushback, not veiled intimidation. She showed it to her father. He read it. his jaw tightening. "We'll inform the police," he said calmly. "This is intimidation, plain and simple. But it also confirms you're onto something that scares them." That night, Emily wrestled with fitful sleep. In fleeting dreams, she stood in front of a vast blackboard covered in complicated legal citations. Voices echoed around her, some mocking, some applauding. She woke drenched in sweat, yet resolved that she would not be bullied into silence. If anything, the threat only underscored the importance of her cause. The next morning, Emily called Stephanie Grant to discuss the threat. The DOJ lawyer's voice was grave. "Stay alert," Grant advised. "People in power will do anything to protect their position, sometimes crossing ethical lines. But don't lose heart. Evidence is stacking up in your favor, and if you keep your composure, we can fight for systemic change." Emily clung to that hope. The seriousness of the situation made her realize that if they succeeded, it could open doors not only for the girl at the center of the case, but for countless others facing similar roadblocks. Whatever it took, she intended to see this through. The next phase of the hearing dawned with a swirl of new developments that took even seasoned court watchers by surprise. That morning, Emily arrived at the courthouse to find not only local journalists but also national news crews camped on the steps. Microphones and flashing cameras met her as she stepped out of her father's car. She tried to steel herself, reciting in her mind the careful lines she'd prepared should a reporter corner her. Inside, the air felt electric. Judge Carver's stern expression telegraphed that he was in no mood for frivolity. Yet the scene was anything but ordinary. A swarm of attorneys surrounded the defense table, and Emily couldn't help noticing Stephanie Grant conferring with members of her DOJ team at the back of the room. Something big was happening. When proceedings began, a uniformed clerk hurried to the judge's bench, whispering urgently. Judge Carver's eyes flickered with shock, an expression rarely seen on his usually stoic face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we've just learned of a federal investigation that ties directly to the policies under dispute in this case." A ripple of gasps traveled through the spectators. Emily's heart hammered. A federal investigation? Could it be related to discriminatory school admissions across the state, exactly as she and her father suspected? Richard Daniels, a representative for the California Association of Public School Administrators, suddenly strode into the courtroom, pointing an accusing finger at Emily. "This is outrageous," he bellowed. "She's only a teenager with no idea the Pandora's box she's opening. This case could tear down entire school systems if we're not careful." Judge Carver's gavel slammed onto the block. "Mr. Daniels, you are out of order," he said, voice reverberating through the hushed crowd. "If you have concerns, you will voice them civilly." Daniels backed off but continued glowering at Emily. When the judge allowed him to speak, Daniels insisted the lawsuit was a Trojan horse orchestrated by federal authorities to expand their control over local education. Emily felt a prickle of indignation burn at the back of her neck. She stood up straight, her voice unwavering as she replied, "No, sir. This case is about giving students their rightful access to schools. If that makes anyone uncomfortable, it's because they have something to hide." Stephanie Grant then addressed the court, revealing that the Department of Justice believed Emily's lawsuit could form a critical piece in a larger puzzle. Months' worth of complaints about admissions discrimination were aligning with the facts of Emily's case. "We need time to compile and present this evidence," Grant said. "It's imperative that the court not dismiss these issues as isolated." However, the defense was quick to retaliate. Nancy Whitaker stood, her sharp gaze cutting across the aisle. "Your Honor," she said, "this is an attempt to blow a simple dispute out of proportion for political gain. Our position remains firm. Ms. Taylor's involvement is not just unorthodox, it's improper. We renew our motion to dismiss her from these proceedings." Judge Carver frowned, but decided to postpone any ruling on that motion until he could review the federal developments. While the lawyers argued back and forth, Emily slipped into an internal debate of her own. She was at the epicenter of a political and legal firestorm that reached far beyond one child's admission to school. A potent mixture of excitement and fear coursed through her. When court adjourned for a brief recess, Emily's father escorted her into a quiet hallway. "Emily," he said, scanning her face, "you've sparked a statewide conversation. Do you realize how significant that is?" She nodded, remembering how her entire motive was to protect a student's simple right to an education. Now, she was entangled in a scandal involving possible systematic exclusion. In that hallway, Stephanie Grant found them. "We've intercepted documents indicating there's a concerted effort by powerful lobbying groups to manipulate enrollment data," she explained, her voice hushed. "We suspect they're removing low-income students from rosters to maintain certain performance statistics. If that's true, your case might be the key to exposing it all." Emily's father pressed for details, but Grant didn't want to raise false hopes. "We'll need hard proof," she warned, "and we have to brace for retaliation. They'll do anything to maintain control." It was enough to solidify Emily's resolve. This was no time to step back. Yes, she was terrified, and yes, the fight was towering in scope. But the stakes were too high. She couldn't abandon a cause that might protect countless children. When the bailiff called them back into the courtroom, Emily took her seat beside her dad. Though her hands shook, she placed them firmly on the table, steeling herself for the battles yet to come. By the time Emily returned to court the following week, the headlines had become relentless. News outlets ran stories on the state's potential misuse of public school admissions policies, speculating that money and politics were fueling rampant discrimination. Protesters even gathered outside the courthouse, waving signs demanding educational equity. The atmosphere bristled with urgency. Inside, tension soared when James Collier, a former education lobbyist, took the witness stand for the defense. His manner was smooth, his words carefully measured as he claimed the Department of Justice had pressured school administrators to exaggerate the scale of discrimination. "This is a classic overreach," Collier declared, sending a ripple of consternation through onlookers. "Miss Taylor's case has been weaponized to push a political narrative." Stephanie Grant leaped into action. On cross-examination, she produced internal memos revealing that Collier's lobbying firm had recommended local school boards deny enrollment to certain demographic groups under the guise of policy compliance. Collier bristled. "Those memos are taken out of context," he insisted. But the tension in the air spoke volumes. Emily could almost feel the balance shifting. The more Collier spoke, the clearer it became that powerful interests had orchestrated a system meant to keep specific students out. It was no accident or coincidence. It was calculated. Judge Carver seemed visibly unsettled, leaning forward, listening to every detail with stark attention. Still, Collier's testimony made waves. He suggested that the DOJ had singled out certain districts unfairly, and he cast doubts on Emily's motivations. "A high school sophomore doesn't simply wake up with a perfect constitutional argument," he sneered. "Someone put those words in her mouth." Sensing the blow to her credibility, Emily steeled herself for the inevitable direct attack. During a recess, she paced the hallway, her thoughts spinning. Stephanie Grant found her there, trying to rally her spirits. "He's bluffing. We'll dismantle his claims piece by piece. But be ready. They'll try anything to derail you." Sure enough, Whitaker moved again to have Emily removed from the case on grounds of her lack of standing and expertise. Emily's father argued passionately that legal tradition permitted the plaintiff, or a representative of the plaintiff, to voice their argument, especially if the case involved minors. Judge Carver postponed judgment, saying he would rule after thoroughly reviewing all testimony. Late that afternoon, Emily took the stand again, detailing the real human impact of these policies. Families who couldn't afford legal help, kids forced into underfunded schools or denied a seat entirely, and communities kept in the dark. She spoke with the sincerity of someone unburdened by cynicism, her fervor as transparent as the bright afternoon sun pouring through the windows. Suddenly, an officer entered the courtroom, carrying a stack of subpoenas. They were from the DOJ, demanding each implicated district turn over records relating to enrollment, funding, and communications with lobbying firms. Gasps echoed among spectators. Whitaker sprang up, outraged, accusing the DOJ of grandstanding. But the judge allowed it, remarking on the seriousness of the allegations. Later, after the session, Emily slumped onto a bench in the hallway, exhaustion dripping from every pore. "I never thought it would go this far," she whispered to her father. "These are national headlines now." He sat beside her, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. "You're doing something extraordinary, Em. You're giving a voice to people who've never been heard. No matter how this ends, they can't take that away from you." As they spoke, a reporter spotted them and approached gingerly. "Miss Taylor," she began, "can you comment on the DOJ subpoenas?" Emily felt a flash of anxiety, but took a breath. "All I can say," she replied carefully, "is that if these records confirm systemic exclusion, then we need immediate action. Education is a right, not a privilege." Her father's phone buzzed moments later. A text from Stephanie reading, "We have a big lead. Need to discuss in private." Emily's pulse jumped. Another lead likely meant more proof. More internal documents, more ammunition to confront deeply entrenched practices. She had started this fight for one girl, but it was now about thousands, maybe millions, impacted by institutional injustice. That night, she found herself at the kitchen table, law texts and notepads strewn around like a fortress. She found solace in the routine of reading statutes and summarizing arguments. Each new piece of evidence hardened her resolve. The higher the defense piled allegations against her, the more committed she became to seeing the case through. Though her eyes burned with fatigue, Emily refused to stop. She was no longer just a scared teen stepping into an adult world. She was a voice for students everywhere, armed with truths that demanded to be heard. The courthouse teemed with reporters for what was likely the final chapter of Emily Taylor's extraordinary legal stand. Weeks of evidence, witness testimonies, and explosive revelations had turned this trial into a pivotal showdown. The corridors thrummed with tension as Emily walked toward the heavy wooden doors, her father at her side. Stephanie Grant just behind. Once inside, it felt as though every seat was occupied. Members of the public, activists, curious onlookers, and attorneys. Even Judge Carver seemed more solemn than ever, aware that his next rulings could spark significant changes throughout the state and potentially influence national discourse on education. Emily took her place at the plaintiff's table. Across from her, Nancy Whitaker and James Collier whispered furiously, their expressions grim. The moment the session commenced, Whitaker rose, voice dripping with finality. "Your Honor, the defense insists these proceedings have become too politically charged. We have new evidence indicating the Department of Justice has conspired to sway the outcome." Her words hung in the air like a noxious fog. But this time, Stephanie Grant was ready. She submitted a fresh series of leaked documents, emails in which high-level lobbyists plotted to manipulate enrollment data and discredit any legal challenges. The hush that fell over the courtroom was deafening. Judge Carver examined the papers intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. "These documents," he said finally, "reveal a disturbing pattern of collusion among multiple school districts and lobbying organizations. I see no basis for dismissing this as mere politics. The question now is, how extensive is this wrongdoing, and how does it bear on Miss Taylor's initial claim?" With that cue, Emily stood and delivered her closing argument. Gone were her early jitters. In their place stood a calm, impassioned determination. "We began this case for a single girl who was denied her rightful place in a public school. But in peeling back the layers, we've discovered widespread practices that harm thousands of families. The evidence is plain. There is an organized effort to keep certain students out based on background or financial status. Education is supposed to be the great equalizer. If we allow these barriers to persist, we betray our fundamental values." Her words resonated in a chamber that had heard enough spin and subterfuge. The onlookers, parents, students, advocates, hung on every syllable. Some even dabbed at tears. When she finished, Judge Carver gently cleared his throat. Moments later, The judge broke for deliberation. The wait was excruciating. Emily, her dad, and Stephanie huddled in a corner of the hallway. "No matter what happens," Stephanie said softly, "you've changed the conversation. People are listening." Emily clasped her father's hand. "I hope that's enough," she murmured. Just then, the bailiff stepped out, calling everyone back inside. The final verdict was about to be delivered. Judge Carver settled in, his expression solemn. After thoroughly examining the evidence, hearing testimony from both parties, and considering the broader implications, this court rules in favor of the plaintiff. A collective intake of breath preceded thunderous applause from half the audience, while others remained stunned. The judge hammered his gavel for order, then continued. "The evidence strongly indicates that this denial of access was neither isolated nor accidental. Furthermore, I urge federal authorities to investigate potential violations of constitutional rights on a broader scale." Emily exhaled, feeling as though the tension in her chest had finally given way to relief. She felt tears prick her eyes as she locked gazes with her father, who mouthed, "You did it." Still, Judge Carver wasn't finished. "This decision stands as an immediate directive for the school board to rectify the plaintiff's situation. Additionally, I recommend legislative review to address the systemic issues uncovered here. Ms. Taylor, while your approach was unconventional, your clarity and determination have served the cause of justice." Reporters leaped into action the moment the gavel struck. Cameras flashed, voices rose, and an outpouring of congratulations swept Emily into a whirlwind of microphones and questions. But beyond the euphoria of the moment, Emily understood that the struggle for fair education would continue. This victory was a bright opening, not a final conclusion. Outside, clusters of supporters gathered. Some cheered Emily's name. Others held signs celebrating equitable schooling. Stephanie gave Emily a proud embrace. "You've empowered a generation to speak up," she said. Emily, overwhelmed, simply smiled through happy tears. She and her father finally managed to slip away to a quieter side entrance, the buzz of the crowd echoing behind them. On the steps, they paused under the warm California sun. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned within her: relief, joy, and a sense of daunting responsibility. But above all, she felt hope. "Are you ready for what comes next?" her father asked gently. Emily raised her gaze, her voice soft but resolute. "Yes," she answered. "If fighting for what's right got us this far, maybe it can take us further." And in that unspoken moment, Emily realized she had grown from a hesitant teenager into a formidable advocate, ready to keep pushing boundaries for those who needed her most. Emily Taylor's journey began with a simple desire: to correct an injustice that targeted a single student. Yet, in championing that one child's right to learn, she uncovered a much larger network of policies designed to exclude vulnerable populations. Critics mocked her youth, and powerful lobbyists attempted to discredit her at every turn. Nonetheless, Emily's fierce resolve and unwavering belief in equal opportunity carried her through each challenge. Throughout the hearings, Emily and her allies, her dedicated father, the steadfast Stephanie Grant, and others who believed in her, encountered every conceivable obstacle, from personal threats and legal technicalities to orchestrated smear campaigns. Each hurdle aimed to intimidate her into silence. But as the truth stacked up, so did the public outcry. Parents and advocacy groups saw reflections of their own struggles in Emily's efforts, fueling a growing demand for real reform. By the time the final verdict was delivered, Emily had already altered the landscape of educational policy in ways she never anticipated. Her story went beyond a single courtroom victory. It testified to the power of everyday citizens, yes, even teenagers, to confront institutions that sometimes forget they exist to serve the people. Looking ahead, Emily recognized that her fight was only a chapter in the ongoing pursuit of fairness. There were still districts clinging to outdated practices and political forces seeking to maintain their grip on power. But if her case proved anything, it was that truth and determination can break through the most entrenched barriers. As she stepped away from the courthouse, she carried that knowledge forward, committed to ensuring the door of opportunity remains open for all.